February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima. Before dawn, the island was quiet, except for the low hiss of the sea grinding against black volcanic sand. In the Japanese tunnels below Mount Suribachi, soldiers waited, pale, dehydrated, motionless. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and yet an unspoken tension moved through the air. At 6:40 a.m. the horizon trembled. Battleships opened fire. The ground above them began to melt. Steel, ash, and rock folded into one. For 70 minutes the island disappeared beneath flame and thunder. Then suddenly silence. Through the smoke, dark shapes appeared on the surf, landing craft packed tight with men in olive drab. They moved forward in straight lines, unshaken by the chaos around them. Even from a distance, Japanese officers could sense it. These were not ordinary soldiers. When the first wave hit the beach, they did not break. They advanced through fire, through death, through impossible terrain. No hesitation, no retreat. The Japanese defenders would soon realize this enemy would not stop until every inch of ground was taken. This was the beginning of their most feared encounter with the United States Marines. In the early months of 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at its greatest reach. From the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, its banners flew across half the Pacific Ocean. The Western colonial powers had been humiliated, the British at Singapore, the Americans at the Philippines, Japanese soldiers, with growing dread. They began reinforcing bunkers deeper underground, developing new defensive systems and issuing orders emphasizing extermination over victory. To them, fighting Marines meant annihilation. There would be no survivors, only mutual destruction. The key difference lay in how each side understood death. Japanese troops fought for honor through sacrifice. Marines fought through endurance. One sought redemption in dying well, the other in surviving to complete the mission. On the battlefield, those two philosophies collided with catastrophic intensity. By late 1943, the United States had begun its island-hopping strategy, bypassing major strongholds and striking directly at critical islands that could serve as airfields or naval bases. Every landing refined the art of amphibious warfare. Tanks adapted to coral beaches, flamethrowers against caves, naval bombardments synchronized with precision timing. The Japanese soon learned that the Marines' reputation was not built on numbers or equipment alone. It was built on discipline under chaos, an ability to advance through conditions that should have broken them. To the defenders it seemed supernatural, and so, from Tarawa to Peleliu, the Japanese prepared not to win, but to die in a way that would make the Marines remember them. Yet each time the Marines came, stronger, more precise, and more relentless than before. This evolving cycle of fear, respect, and brutality would shape the psychological war between the two forces, setting the stage for the bloodiest battles the Pacific would ever witness. The next phase of this transformation began in the heart of Japan's newly fortified island perimeter, where both sides would redefine the limits of endurance. By the beginning of 1944, Japan's Pacific Empire was no longer expanding, it was eroding. The momentum that had once carried its armies across oceans was now trapped behind layers of isolated islands. Each new marine landing meant another severed artery in Japan's defensive network. Inside Tokyo's military command, officers studied the reports with growing alarm. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Gilbert Islands, all lost in less than 18 months. But what disturbed them most was not the scale of defeat, it was how they were defeated. The enemy's resolve, particularly among the US Marines, defied Japanese understanding of Western warfare. The Imperial Army had long believed that Americans were soft, unwilling to sustain casualties dependent on machines and comfort. That belief was shattered on the beaches of Tarawa. In 76 hours, the Marines had stormed an island fortress the Japanese believed impregnable, defended by 4,500 elite troops entrenched in reinforced bunkers. When the battle ended, only 17 Japanese remained alive. The Marines had paid for it in blood, over 1,000 dead, 2,000 wounded, but they had taken the island. The Japanese realized this was not an army that feared death, this was an enemy that weaponized it. Meanwhile, in the United States, the war effort was transforming the Marines into an industrially supported war machine. Training centers like Camp Pendleton and Paris Island turned recruits into amphibious shock troops with single-minded focus. The Corps developed landing doctrines through brutal trial and error, studying each battle, refining tactics and adjusting weaponry. Every failure became a blueprint for the next victory. Behind the strategy stood men like General Holland M. Smith, Howlin' Mad Smith, whose aggressive leadership drove the doctrine of coordinated air, sea, and ground assaults. The Navy's massive fleets acted as floating fortresses, while Marine engineers and assault teams learned to dismantle enemy defenses bunker by bunker. To the Japanese, this appeared as an unstoppable evolution. Each encounter with the Marines meant facing a more efficient, more determined version of the same foe. Reports from officers in the Marianas Campaign noted that the Americans attacked with what seemed to be preternatural precision. Artillery synchronized to seconds, flamethrowers clearing trenches before counterfire could begin, medics working under direct fire to pull back the wounded. Japanese command began to circulate internal memorandums warning garrisons, the enemy Marine is not a normal soldier. He fights like a beast, advancing through wounds, fighting to the last man. But fear was only part of the equation. There was also a grudging respect. Japanese officers trained to despise Western weakness could not ignore the endurance and aggression of the Marines. Both sides shared an almost spiritual devotion to their cause, one to the Emperor, the other to the Corps. In a strange symmetry, they mirrored each other in discipline, in the pride of unit identity, and in the unyielding refusal to retreat. The war was now a duel between two forces that understood only absolute commitment. As 1944 progressed, the Marines pushed through the Marshalls, then the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each island brought closer proximity to the Japanese homeland, and each battle deepened the psychological scar on Japan's defenders. At Saipan, the Imperial Command witnessed the collapse of its own myth. Over 29,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island. Many civilians committed suicide rather than surrender. For the first time, Japan saw its own people caught in the firestorm of total war. For the Marines, Saipan was both victory and nightmare. The casualty lists grew longer, and yet morale hardened. The Corps had become an organism that thrived in attrition, every loss feeding the determination of the next landing. By late 1944, Japan knew the next battles would reach sacred ground. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the threshold of the home islands. Orders were issued to every soldier. There would be no surrender, no retreat, only death. The Imperial General Staff called it decisive battle, and the men who would meet them there, the United States Marines, were ready to fight a war that no longer distinguished survival from victory. As both nations braced for the final stage of the Pacific conflict, the confrontation between these two forces became not merely military, but existential, a collision of identities that would burn itself into history. The human, tactical, and psychological dimensions of this rivalry would define the nature of combat in the Pacific. The first angle is human psychology. Japanese soldiers were trained to expect fear in their enemies, yet Marines exhibited something entirely alien, calm aggression under fire. In Tarawa, Guadalcanal, and Saipan, Marines advanced through torrents of artillery, machine gun fire, and flamethrowers without hesitation. Japanese diaries repeatedly mention a disbelief at this composure. One officer wrote, "They do not flinch. Even when surrounded, they push forward. It is as if death cannot touch them." The Marines' willingness to sustain injury while continuing the mission created a perception of invincibility. To Japanese soldiers, who equated courage with suicidal honor, this endurance was disorienting. Next is tactical methodology. The Marines were not improvising, each movement was calculated. Amphibious doctrine emphasized combined arms, timing, and redundancy. Artillery barrages were measured to suppress, not obliterate, giving infantry a path forward. Engineers cleared obstacles systematically. Flamethrowers, mortars, and naval gunfire worked in sequence. The Japanese were trained for static defense. Their artillery was often imprecise or inadequately coordinated. The Marines' methodical efficiency made them deadly beyond raw firepower. Technological integration forms the third angle. The Marines maximized the synergy of weapons, vehicles, and communication. Landing craft were specialized for coral reefs. Armored bulldozers created paths through obstacles. Radios coordinated forward observers, artillery, and naval gunfire in real time. Japanese defenders faced a moving battlefield that constantly adapted to them, neutralizing their prepared positions. Reports from Iwo Jima show defenders killed before they could react because every move was anticipated. Leadership and doctrine provide a fourth perspective. Marine officers like Holland Smith, Clifton Sprague, and others emphasized initiative at the platoon and company levels. Leaders trained their men to make independent decisions while maintaining cohesion. Japanese doctrine centralized command, limiting flexibility in chaotic conditions. On the battlefield, this meant Marines exploited openings instantly, while Japanese units often waited for orders they would never receive. The fifth angle is enemy perception and morale. Japanese soldiers did not just fight Marines, they feared them uniquely. Across multiple campaigns, a recurring theme emerges: Marines were considered implacable, inhuman opponents. Captured Japanese officers reported that the Marines' reputation alone could shape defense strategies, often causing troops to fortify positions excessively or prepare for death instead of maneuver. Fear became a force multiplier for the Marines. Finally, moral and ideological contrast influenced combat intensity. The Japanese embraced death as honor, surrender was shame. Marines fought under a code of mission completion, survival, and unit integrity. To the Japanese, this difference made Marines unpredictable. They did not fight to die, they fought to endure. This endurance meant the Japanese could not predict when or how the enemy would break, compounding their psychological stress. These angles converge to explain a singular reality: the Marines represented a form of warfare that Japanese soldiers could not neutralize with traditional doctrine or courage alone. They combined physical endurance, tactical sophistication, technological innovation, and adaptive leadership in a way that shattered preconceptions of Western weakness. The intensity of these encounters set the stage for confrontations where survival and annihilation collided, battles that would define the Pacific War and leave an indelible impression on both sides. The first angle in this section is amphibious assault mastery. The Marines perfected the art of landing on fortified beaches. Every detail, timing, wave formation, cover fire, was rehearsed and refined from the early Pacific campaigns. At Tarawa, landing craft hit coral reefs under heavy fire, yet Marines pressed forward. Engineers waded into surf to clear obstacles, while machine gun teams suppressed enemy bunkers. Japanese defenders had anticipated chaos, but the Marines' coordination reduced confusion and multiplied lethality. By the time defenders realized the landing points had been breached, Marines were already digging in and establishing fire support positions. Firepower coordination is the next critical angle. Artillery, naval gunfire, and aerial bombardments were integrated with infantry movement. The Marines' ability to call in precise support allowed small units to dominate positions 10 times their size. Japanese artillery often fired without coordination, wasting rounds or creating gaps that Marines exploited. Flame weapons and demolition charges were employed in synchronization with suppressive fire, systematically neutralizing fortified caves and pillboxes. This level of precision was unmatched in prior Japanese engagements with Western forces. Endurance under attrition forms the third perspective. Marines absorbed casualties without halting momentum. At Saipan and Iwo Jima, waves of attacks inflicted thousands of wounded, yet the remainder continued forward. Rotations were limited, and medics operated under fire to stabilize and extract the injured. Japanese defenders, expecting morale collapse, were confronted with relentless continuation. This capacity to sustain pressure eroded defensive confidence, turning psychological expectation into operational real. Adaptive leadership is another defining factor. Marine officers empowered junior leaders to act decisively. Platoon and squad-level autonomy meant that even if command structures were disrupted, units adapted to battlefield conditions without losing cohesion. Japanese forces, conditioned to centralized command and rigid hierarchies, were vulnerable when lines broke or communication failed. This difference magnified the effectiveness of Marine small unit tactics, often determining the outcome before larger reinforcements arrived. Psychological impact on Japanese troops must be considered. Across multiple campaigns, Japanese soldiers internalized a unique fear: Marines would not surrender, would not retreat, and would continue to advance despite casualties. Propaganda within the Japanese ranks emphasized that Marines were demons or beasts, a perception reinforced by repeated encounters. This fear influenced defensive preparations. Soldiers fortified caves excessively, distributed units in fragmented patterns, and sometimes committed premature banzai charges. Fear became a strategic liability, shaping the battlefield before combat even began. Finally, cultural and moral contrast continued to play a decisive role. Japanese doctrine valued death for honor, Marines valued survival for mission completion. This distinction made Marine behavior unpredictable from the perspective of Japanese planners. Unlike Western Allied forces in Europe, who often relied on strategic withdrawal or surrender under pressure, Marines combined aggression with endurance. To Japanese troops, this defiance of expectation amplified the terror of confrontation, reinforcing the myth of invincibility that grew with every island campaign. These angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy perception and moral, intersect to explain why Japanese forces regarded Marines with unparalleled respect and fear. Each encounter compounded the legend: small unit discipline, coordinated firepower, amphibious expertise, psychological resilience. Japanese defensive planning became as much about anticipating the Marines' relentless persistence as about terrain or numbers. The lessons drawn from these angles culminated in the Pacific's bloodiest confrontations, where human endurance and tactical innovation collided with tradition and ideology. The stage was set for battles that would test the limits of both sides, forcing every soldier to confront not only an enemy in arms, but an enemy in essence. November 20th, 1943, Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. The morning sun barely cut through the low clouds as the first wave of Marines approached the coral-fringed beaches. From the Japanese fortifications, 4,500 defenders watched the surf churn with landing craft. The Americans were precise, methodical, and unrelenting. The first boats ran aground on the coral reefs. Japanese gunners opened fire with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Corpses fell into the surf, yet Marines continued to press forward. Engineers waded waist-deep into water under fire, using Bangalore torpedoes to clear obstacles while riflemen advanced behind, covering fire. Every bunker that was neutralized revealed another. The Japanese had prepared for attrition, yet the Marines refused to halt their momentum. For 76 hours, the battle raged. Marines advanced in small units, exploiting every gap and weakness, employing flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear pillboxes and trenches. Japanese soldiers launched counterattacks, banzai charges that tore through waves of Marines, yet they could not reclaim the ground. Every tactical expectation of the defenders that the Americans would falter under fire was disproven. In the center of the atoll, commanding officers observed the effect. Japanese diaries later recorded astonishment. They fight as if death cannot touch them. Even when cut down, others take their place without pause. By the time the battle ended, nearly all Japanese RS were dead. The Marines suffered over 1,000 fatalities and more than 2,000 wounded, staggering losses, yet the island was secured. Tarawa was the first vivid proof to the Japanese that the Marines were an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The combination of endurance, tactical precision, and coordinated firepower shattered assumptions of Western weakness. Every fallen Marine only intensified the resolve of the survivors. Every advance reinforced the psychological impact on Japanese troops elsewhere in the Pacific. The significance extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Commanders on neighboring islands began to prepare differently. Bunkers were reinforced, caves deepened, and troops instructed to fight to the last man. Fear and respect intertwined. The Marines' reputation became an operational factor, shaping Japanese strategy as much as geography or artillery. The Tarawa landing demonstrated the defining characteristic of Marine assaults: relentless progression under fire. The enemy could inflict damage but could not stop the movement. It set a precedent for every island campaign that followed: Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and eventually Iwo Jima. Each subsequent battle would be measured against Tarawa. Could the Japanese inflict enough casualties to deter, or would the Marines continue to press forward, unbroken? The Marines' success also forced strategic reflection within the Japanese High Command. They recognized a new variable. This was not merely a war of numbers or terrain, but of psychological endurance. Soldiers would face an enemy who adapted quickly, coordinated precisely, and fought with an unyielding will. By the time the Marines prepared for their next landing, on Kwajalein and Saipan, both sides had internalized lessons from Tarawa. Japanese defenses became more sophisticated, yet the Marines had learned from their own losses. Every error at Tarawa was recorded, every tactic refined. In these moments, the battle ceased to be just a tactical encounter. It became a crucible in which the limits of human endurance, tactical coordination, and battlefield psychology were tested simultaneously. The Marines had proven their capacity to achieve objectives under conditions that would have broken conventional armies. The stage was set for the next escalation. Saipan and Iwo Jima would magnify the same dynamics observed at Tarawa, transforming isolated acts of heroism into a sustained demonstration of institutionalized, relentless combat doctrine. The Japanese defenders now faced an enemy whose very presence demanded recalculation, not merely of strategy, but of the meaning of resistance itself. February 19th, 1945. The island loomed black, stretching into the surf like a smoldering warning. Japanese defenders had prepared for months, tunneling deep into Mount Suribachi, constructing interlocking bunkers and emplacing artillery to cover every approach. Yet the Marines advanced with a methodical precision that would test the limits of even the most hardened garrison. At 6:30 a.m., naval gunfire pounded the beaches, artillery and mortars struck the inland fortifications, yet the Japanese did not retreat, they were waiting. When the first waves of amphibious vehicles hit the surf, Marines waded through waist-deep water under concentrated machine gun fire. They carried heavy packs, rifles, flamethrowers, and explosives. Every step forward was met with resistance, yet they pushed relentlessly, securing footholds despite staggering casualties. Inside the tunnels, Japanese soldiers observed the attack. They had fought many enemies, but these men were different. Reports from officers later described Marines advancing calmly, methodically, often replacing fallen comrades without hesitation. The defenders attempted counterattacks, banzai charges, and artillery barrages, but nothing halted the advance. For every bunker cleared, more Marines emerged, pressing toward the Sioux. Mit of Suribachi. The battle stretched for 36 days. Every hill, every crater, every ridge became a site of brutal hand-to-hand combat. Flamethrowers and demolition teams systematically eliminated defensive positions. Coordinated artillery and close air support suppressed Japanese movements with uncanny timing. Casualty rates soared on both sides. Over 6,800 Marines wounded or killed, and nearly 18,000 Japanese soldiers dead. Yet the Marines advanced inch by inch, until the iconic flag raising atop Suribachi marked a symbolic, though not final, victory. Iwo Jima revealed the full scope of Marine capability. Tarawa had introduced the Marines as relentless attackers. Iwo Jima demonstrated their endurance, coordination, and adaptability under sustained attrition. For Japanese commanders, the psychological impact was profound. Officers recorded astonishment at the Marines' ability to absorb casualties and continue forward without disintegration. Traditional expectations of Western armies, retreat under fire, collapse when encircled, were shattered. The battle also magnified leadership contrasts. Marine officers empowered junior leaders to make rapid, independent decisions under chaotic conditions. Platoons adapted on the fly, coordinating with artillery and air support in real time. Japanese units, though fiercely trained, adhered to centralized command and pre-planned responses. When communication lines were disrupted, their reactions were often delayed or ineffective, while the Marines exploited every weakness. Iwo Jima's intensity foreshadowed Okinawa. By April 1945, Japanese forces faced a larger, more technologically integrated Marine force. Every tactic the Japanese had relied upon, fortifications, banzai charges, fanatical defense, was met with precise countermeasures. Firepower coordination, combined arms assaults, and small unit autonomy had become institutionalized. The Marines did not merely survive the enemy, they dominated through persistence, innovation, and adaptation. The Japanese had underestimated the psychological component of Marine warfare. Their doctrine prized courage through sacrifice. The Marines' courage lay in enduring, in advancing, and in completing the mission. This divergence made every engagement an existential test. Each Marine who pressed forward under fire intensified the dread among defenders, who recognized that conventional strategies might no longer suffice. By the end of Okinawa, the Japanese perception was clear. Marines were the most dangerous adversary they had ever faced. Not because of individual skill alone, or even superior equipment, but because of the synthesis of endurance, precision, leadership, and coordination. The Marines embodied a level of combat effectiveness that forced defenders to rethink every assumption, from training to psychology to tactical deployment. These battles, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, were not isolated events. They were a continuum, each escalating the stakes and deepening the fear and respect Japanese troops held for the US Marines. The cumulative effect reshaped Japanese defensive doctrine and left a lasting imprint on the collective memory of the Pacific War. The stage was now set for the aftermath, the consequences of these engagements, the toll on human life, strategy and psychology, and the enduring legacy of the Marines' relentless campaigns. The battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima left the Imperial Japanese Army shattered, both physically and psychologically. On each island, Japanese forces suffered near total annihilation. At Tarawa, fewer than 20 defenders survived out of 4,500. At Saipan, 29,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, many alongside civilians who committed mass suicides. Iwo Jima cost the Japanese nearly 18,000 men. Across the Pacific, the consistent pattern was clear. The Marines did not merely defeat Japanese troops, they dismantled defensive doctrines and shattered morale, captured diaries and postbar. TTLA reports reveal the depth of this psychological impact. Officers noted that fear of Marines affected troop deployment, often dictating defensive construction and preemptive suicidal measures. One Saipan officer wrote, "The Marines do not retreat, they advance even when wounded. To face them is to confront death incarnate." Japanese military communications increasingly framed the Marines as more dangerous than any other Allied unit. Their tactics and endurance were treated not merely as a physical threat, but as a psychological weapon. On the American side, the cost was equally sobering. Tarawa taught the Marines that precision planning, combined arms, and relentless aggression came at a price. Casualties were high, and operational lessons were hard-earned. At Iwo Jima, over 6,800 Marines were killed or wounded, yet each engagement refined doctrine. Amphibious landings became more coordinated, artillery and air support more synchronized, and unit-level initiative more emphasized. The Marines' reputation spread rapidly among Japanese defenders on subsequent islands. Okinawa and the planned invasions of Kyushu and the Japanese home islands carried the specter of these previous engagements. The psychological dominance of the Marines had become institutionalized in Japanese planning. Even heavily fortified positions could not compensate for the fear that their approach inspired. Reports from Japanese high command after Iwo Jima reflect strategic anxiety. Defenders were instructed to fight to the last man, a recognition that conventional retreat or surrender would only aid the Marines. Every island campaign reinforced the perception that Marines operated differently than other Allied forces. They were relentless, highly coordinated, and psychologically unyielding. This led to increasingly desperate and often suicidal measures, including fortified caves, banzai charges, and civilian mobilization for defense, all of which compounded casualties without changing outcomes. The aftermath also reshaped American understanding of combat in the Pacific. The Corps recognized the necessity of integrating technology, leadership, and endurance into doctrine. Lessons from Tarawa and Iwo Jima influenced every subsequent amphibious landing, contributing to a cumulative mastery that defined the Marines' identity. Victory was not simply measured by territory gained, but by the effectiveness and survivability of each assault under extreme conditions. Japanese reflections confirmed the unique nature of the threat. Unlike European theaters, where the Wehrmacht or other Allied forces could be outmaneuvered or forced to retreat, the Marines exhibited a singular combination of traits: disciplined aggression, tactical flexibility, and psychological resilience. Across multiple campaigns, Japanese commanders increasingly cited the Marines' approach as the central challenge in defending the Pacific perimeter. These cumulative experiences set the stage for the final confrontation. Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific, where the full synthesis of marine capability, endurance, firepower, leadership, and coordination would meet the last, desperate measures of the Japanese defensive strategy. The next phase of the aftermath will examine the consequences of Okinawa and other late-stage battles, analyzing both human cost and operational evolution. April 1, 1945, Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific, became the ultimate measure of marine capability and Japanese resolve. Over 180,000 U.S. Marines and Army personnel landed against a meticulously fortified Japanese force of roughly 100,000. The battle extended for 82 days, combining conventional combat with entrenched, suicidal defense. Civilian casualties further amplified the human cost as Okinawan towns became battlefields. Japanese commanders, having internalized lessons from previous marine encounters, designed the island's defense with depth, interlocking positions. ND fortified caves. Yet the Marines' methodical approach neutralized these advantages. Artillery, air support, naval bombardment, flamethrowers, and demolition teams worked in precise coordination. Even when faced with kamikaze attacks and banzai charges, Marines pressed forward. They advanced unit by unit, clearing tunnels, pillboxes, and ridges with tenacity honed through years of Pacific warfare. The psychological impact on Japanese troops reached its zenith. Diaries and captured communications reveal mounting despair. No matter how many die, they continue. Retreat is impossible, surrender unthinkable. The Marines' reputation as unrelenting, adaptable, and disciplined fighters had become fully realized. Fear of these troops influenced every defensive decision, from troop placements to counterattack timing. In essence, the Marines had become an operational factor before the first shot was fired. Casualties were staggering. Over 12,000 Americans were killed or wounded, while Japanese forces suffered approximately 77,000 fatalities. Civilian deaths numbered in the tens of thousands. The battle demonstrated that marine endurance and tactical coordination could overcome even the most desperate and deeply entrenched defenses. Each successive engagement reinforced the doctrine of combined arms, small unit initiative, and psychological pressure as key elements of success. The aftermath extended beyond numbers. Japanese military analysis recognized that the Marines were unique among Allied forces. European theaters involved maneuver, attrition, or retreat. The Pacific revealed an enemy willing to advance under extreme conditions, sustain casualties, and maintain cohesion without hesitation. Okinawa cemented the perception that Marines were psychologically as well as tactically formidable. For the United States, Okinawa validated the Corps' evolution. Every prior campaign, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, had informed operational refinements. Amphibious assaults were now executed with unprecedented coordination. Junior leaders were empowered to adapt. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire, and combined arms integration became seamless. The Marines had not only taken the island, but institutionalized lessons that would define the Corps' identity. The consequences for Japanese defenders were existential. Conventional doctrine had failed to halt the Marines. Combination of relentless assault, precise coordination, and sustained endurance had stripped away the effectiveness of static fortifications and suicidal counterattacks. The human cost, both military and civilian, was catastrophic, illustrating the destructive magnitude of total war in the Pacific. This period also left a lasting imprint on the psychology of Japanese troops. Subsequent planning for the defense of the home islands reflected an acute awareness of the Marines' capabilities. Propaganda emphasized ferocity and sacrifice, yet officers knew that even extreme measures might not stop an enemy conditioned to endure and adapt. Marines were feared not only for their weapons or numbers, but for the immutable will to achieve objectives regardless of personal cost. The series of battles from Tarawa to Okinawa demonstrated a defining pattern. The Marines imposed operational inevitability. Their combination of endurance, coordination, tactical innovation, and leadership made them uniquely effective. Japanese forces understood this deeply. Every defensive strategy was influenced by the anticipation of Marine assaults. Respect and terror became inseparable. The aftermath of these engagements set the conditions for the final phase of the Pacific War. Japanese defensive doctrine had been tested, their soldiers psychologically strained, and the Marines' operational dominance established. The human and strategic consequences of these campaigns would resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield, shaping both military thought and historical memory. The campaigns across the Pacific yield a stark truth. The U.S. Marines were not merely soldiers, they were an embodiment of institutionalized endurance, precision, and adaptability. From Tarawa to Okinawa, every landing, every assault, and every advance tested both human limits and tactical ingenuity. The Japanese defenders, steeped in a doctrine that valued death for honor, confronted an enemy whose courage was measured in persistence, not sacrifice. This fundamental divergence defined every encounter and left an indelible mark on the nature of warfare in the Pacific. The psychological dimension of combat became as decisive as the physical. Japanese diaries and officer reports emphasize a unique fear, a respect bordering on dread, for the Marines' relentless advance. They fought not to die heroically, but to achieve objectives despite fire, terrain, and casualties. This unyielding ethos confounded defenders, influencing decisions before engagement and dictating defensive strategy in ways that purely numerical or technological advantages could not. Technological integration, tactical innovation, and adaptive leadership coalesced in the Marines to form a force capable of overcoming entrenched positions, attrition, and desperation. Every operation was a cumulative refinement of doctrine, every casualty a lesson embedded into the Corps' institutional memory. In this, the Marines became more than an army. They became a psychological and operational inevitability, a measure against which Japanese defenses were tested and found wanting. History records more than victories or losses, it records human extremes. The Pacific campaigns illuminate the collision of two profoundly disciplined cultures, one defined by the willingness to die, the other by the determination to endure. In this collision, the Marines earned a reputation that transcended their uniform and weapons, a reputation that inspired respect, fear, and lasting study. The enduring lesson is not of heroism alone, but of systemic mastery, how training, doctrine, leadership, and psychological resilience can create a force that reshapes the battlefield and the mindsets of those who confront it. The Japanese realization that Marines fought differently, endured differently, and adapted relentlessly remains a central insight into the conduct of total war. In the end, the Pacific was not merely a series of battles, it was a crucible in which the essence of combat and human endurance were tested. The Marines left an imprint far beyond the sand, rock, and blood of the islands, a legacy of relentless determination that redefined the art of war in the modern era.